may not know this about me, and you may find it a little difficult to believe, but at least from the platform, I don't like repeating myself. Like I have these inner dialogues sometimes going, have I told this story before? Have I used this illustration before? It feels really familiar. And because I know some of you are sitting there going, we know how this one ends. Like we know you've said you've done this before. Now I do repeat myself. I just don't like to repeat myself, which makes it difficult to say what I'm about to say, because some of you immediately are going to go, we've heard this before. But Loganville High School baseball team won the state championship. Again. Coach Brand Mills, right here. Everybody give it up for Coach Brand Mills. We are glad to have Brand and Carolyn and their family in our church back to back, three-peat, however you want to wrap it up. I would say it this way: every year that Brand Mills has been the head coach, they've won the state championship. So you say it however you want to say. I'm getting that T-shirt made if you want me to order you one. But great game. I got to see 2 of the 3 championship games this past week, and just fantastic baseball. Great to cheer them on. I am glad that you're worshiping with us. Whenever, switching gears, whenever there's a tragedy, whenever there's a disaster, whenever there is an unexpected event, a catastrophe, there is the actual well-known event, right? It gets publicized, it gets talked about. We watch it over and over again on the news. We see videos of it. We know this thing happened, the Challenger space shuttle explosion. Some of you, like me, are old enough to remember that. I was a senior in high school when that happened. You remember that image. Some of us, because I was still in high school, we were in class watching on TV. Some of you had that experience as well. You remember that event, 9/11, same thing. There are images of that day that you remember, but reaching back farther in history, the Titanic. Like there was an event, that thing happened. We know what that thing is. Everybody knows what that thing is. However, most disasters, maybe all disasters of that type, are never one thing. It's never just that one event that happened that caused that event. It is rather what is referred to as an event cascade, or sometimes called a cascade effect. It is multiple things that all happened in a particular order, and it was the combination of all of those things, something that got ignored, a warning that got dismissed, one item that they forgot to check, no one looked at. Just little items that combine over time to lead to end up being this great moment that we all know about. It's for that reason that we have documentaries, we have movies. Once you start peeling the layers back from that event, then they start making miniseries out of it. And they start saying, well, this happened, and this guy spoke up, but nobody said anything. And that lady tried to intervene, and nobody listened to what she had to say. An event cascade. And often in these event cascades, if only one of the things had been caught along the way, the disaster could have been prevented. Like if just somebody had listened, if this one thing had been double checked. It's one of the reasons catastrophes like that are so disheartening, are so heartbreaking to go back and watch the miniseries, because you think, oh, if just one thing had been different, they had just changed this little thing. I mentioned the Titanic, and we know Titanic hits an iceberg and sinks. Like that's in everybody's memory. Leonardo DiCaprio dies. There's enough room on the door, but he's not up there. He dies. It's tragic. Rose throws the thing overboard. We got that. Like we know that happened, but the reality was Titanic is one of those cascade effect events because the weather conditions were poor. Warnings were dismissed. Again and again, they were warned. You're heading into some really difficult water. The speed was much too fast and increasing day over day for the conditions. The men who were supposed to be on lookout had to do so with the naked eye, because the binoculars that they were supposed to use to spot icebergs and other dangers were in a lockbox, and someone had inadvertently carried the key to the lockbox off of the ship before it set sail. Now, they could have broken into the lockbox, but they didn't. They tried to see with the naked eye. The rivets on the hull of the ship were made from an inferior material. There's kind of a long story about how that actually happened, and quite possibly, if any one of those things had been different, we may have never even heard of the Titanic. There certainly would not be movies and miniseries and documentaries. It was one thing after another, one mistake compounded by another mistake, compounded by another mistake, that ended up in the catastrophe that we all know. When people have personal disasters, personal catastrophes, relational catastrophes, catastrophes of their integrity, marriage catastrophes, almost every single case, it is not one thing. There is a moment when it all comes to light and it all becomes public. But that moment is just the tip of the iceberg, sorry for the use of that, of so much underneath that built up over time. We're studying the life of Solomon, an incredibly wise king. He asked God for wisdom, and God gave him wisdom. He ruled over a time of expansion and growth of wealth and growth of influence for the nation of Israel. Coming off his father, King David's reign, Solomon reigns for 40 years, and it is a time of massive expansion and influence and dominance. We talked about last week how Solomon builds for God this magnificent temple, this incredible place for the presence of God to reside among his people. And for when people had to sacrifice, when they wanted to go to worship, they would go to this temple and they would worship there. As they're dedicating that temple, Solomon speaks to the people in 1 Kings chapter 8, and he kind of reminds them of the history leading up to this moment. My father, King David, wanted to build a temple for God, and God did not allow him. But now I, as his son, I have been able to build this temple. And then he prays this prayer of dedication. And it starts out, for about 8 verses, it starts out with praises for God. There's no God like you. We are so blessed by you, God. You have overseen and protected your people. We are thankful for you, God. And then the prayer shifts in tone. When you're at a dedication, like a formal launching, a kickoff of something, you expect the message to be hopeful. Some of you are getting ready to go to commencement services, some tonight, some Tuesday night, some other nights of the week. Some of you have already been to the UGA commencement, and there's probably going to be a speaker. Often at commencements there's a speaker, and you expect for there to be some hopeful message for the graduates. You have the skill, you can do this. You have a bright future ahead of you. Use all that you've learned, apply yourself. Doors are going to open. You expect this sense of encouragement at a commencement address. A dedication is very similar. When you're dedicating something, launching something for the first time, you expect whoever's doing the speaking, whoever's praying the prayer over that moment, to focus on all the good that could come in the future. Just think of how many worship services are going to be in this new temple. We're going to honor you, God, with our songs and our music. We're going to honor you in our sacrifices. This is not the tone of the last 2/3 of Solomon's prayer. Rather, Solomon begins to detail all of the failures he expects the nation to make. He begins to pray things like, God, when your people disobey, not if they disobey, When they disobey, please forgive us. Some examples, stay with me. I'm going to run through these quickly. 1 Kings chapter 8, this is verse 33. When your people Israel have been defeated by an enemy because they have sinned against you. Not very hopeful, is it? And when they turn their back to you and give praise to your name, praying and making supplication to you in this temple, then hear from heaven and forgive the sin of your people of Israel and bring them back to the land you gave to their ancestors. Please forgive us because we're going to blow it. That's inspiring, isn't it? Verse 35, when the heavens are shut up and there is no rain because your people have sinned against you. Verse 37, when famine or plague comes to the land, or blight or mildew, locusts or grasshoppers, or when an enemy besieges them in any of their cities, whatever disaster or disease may come, not exactly dedication worthy, not exactly inspirational. Verse 46, when they sin against you, for there is no one who does not sin. I like that sort of backtracking right there. Like, God, we're not perfect. Just want to throw that in. I mean, everybody sins. And you become angry with them and give them over to their enemies who take them captive to their own lands, far away or near. And if they have a change of heart in the land where they are held captive, and repent and plead with you in the land of their captors, and say, we have sinned, we have done wrong, we have acted wickedly. Again, not the most inspiring dedication speech. You're not rallying the troops right here. Now here's the interesting thing. Everything that Solomon prayed happened. Like every single one. And your guess is as good as mine how he knew. Every single, all the way up to the nation of Israel being taken captive by an enemy. See, as soon as Solomon's reign was over, as soon as he died, the nation gets split in two. They form two allegiances to different kings. So there's a northern kingdom, and then there's a southern kingdom. And they have two kings, and their hearts continually get drawn away to false gods and to foreign gods. And God keeps trying to warn them and bring them back. And ultimately, the history of the nation is that the northern kingdom gets attacked and done away with. The southern kingdom gets taken captive by the Babylonians. And everything Solomon has built gets destroyed, including the temple. This temple that he's dedicating, when the Babylonians come in and take them captive, they're going to wipe this thing out. Here's an example. 2 Kings 25. The commander of the army of Babylon set fire to the temple of the Lord, the royal palace, and all the houses of Jerusalem. Every important building he burned down. The whole Babylonian army under the commander of the imperial guard broke down the walls around Jerusalem. Here's Solomon sitting at the peak of his leadership, sitting at the peak of his accomplishment. And coming down the road is the destruction of everything. Everything he'd built, everything he'd given himself. So why does he pray this prayer? Just a guess. Just a guess. Solomon not only saw the future of the nation, but he saw the future of the nation because Solomon knew what was happening in his own heart at this point. He hadn't gone public with it. He wasn't confessing this to anybody. He wasn't admitting this to anybody. But there were already cracks inside the heart of Solomon. There were problems. I know it's true. Human nature, I've experienced myself. We often know stuff is going on before we admit it to anybody. We're often clued in that we're flying close to the flame. Before anybody else finds out, before our secret gets revealed, before it comes out publicly, before anybody asks us about it, we kind of know. And we're trying to cover it up. We're trying to put on a good face. We're trying to pray the prayer of dedication. And we're trying to say, look at the temple that I built and look what I did for God. But inside, we know there's something unsettled that's going on. This was happening in Solomon. There was little cracks showing up in his life. I'll give you a few. If you read his story carefully, you'll see that the narrator slipped these in. For example, 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 37, the foundation of the temple of the Lord was laid in the 4th year in the month of Ziv. In the 11th year in the month of Bul, the 8th month, the temple was finished in all its details according to its specifications. He, Solomon, had spent 7 years building it. Your Bible ends chapter 6 right there, right? There weren't chapters originally, but our chapter 6 ends. This is the beginning of chapter 7. It took Solomon 13 years, however, to complete the construction of his palace. Math seem funny to you? Does it seem odd that Solomon, called to build the temple, spends 7 years on God's temple and 13 years on his? Seems odd. Huh? Maybe it's just a small thing. Maybe it's just a small crack. Maybe it's just a little thing. Actually, maybe it's nothing. Maybe it's nothing. But it's there. But it happened. You may not remember from last week, but a part of building the temple, Solomon reaches out to Hiram, king of Tyre, and says, hey, can you send me some skilled workers? Can you support this project? And Hiram, he had a good relationship with David. He said, absolutely. I'm going to send you some resources. I'm going to send you some personnel. Solomon wants to thank Hiram. This is 1 Kings chapter 9, verse 10. At the end of 20 years, during which Solomon built these two buildings, the temple of the Lord and the royal palace, King Solomon gave 20 towns in Galilee to Hiram, king of Tyre, because Hiram had supplied him with all the cedar and juniper and gold he wanted. Nice gesture. Thank you, Hiram. You know what I'm going to give you 20 cities. Right, I'm going to give you 20 cities just down the road. They're yours. I'm grateful. Verse 10 says, but when Hiram went from Tyre to see the towns that Solomon had given him, he was not pleased with them. What kind of towns are these you have given me, my brother? He asked. And he called them the land of Kabul, a name they have to this day. My Bible has a little note at the bottom that says, Kabul sounds like the Hebrew for good for nothing. If you need to use that sometime this week, Kabul. Got some people that you work with. You just might want to remember that. They won't know what you're talking about. Kabul, good for nothing. Now Hiram had sent the king 120 talents of gold. So comparison, 4.5 tons of gold, plus cedar and juniper and skilled workers, 20 towns that were good for nothing. Not exactly a fair trade. Not exactly an appropriate thank you for all that Hiram had done for Solomon. And maybe it's just a small thing, and maybe we're reading way too much into this. Maybe it's just like a little crack. Maybe it's nothing. I mean, maybe it's nothing. But it's there. Peeking through the story. 1 Kings chapter 3, verse 1. Solomon made an alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and married his daughter. He brought her to the city of David until he finished building his palace and the temple of the Lord and the wall around Jerusalem. He married Pharaoh, the king of Egypt's daughter. But God had specifically told his people, don't intermarry with people who don't worship your God. This was not a racial thing. This was not a cultural thing. This was a spiritual thing. If they worship false gods, don't be in relationship with them. Don't marry them. They will pull your heart away from God. And maybe this was just a business transaction. I mean, it was a business transaction. It was a political transaction. I mean, in one sense, you can see the brilliance of you have a close foreign country, potential enemy. you marry the king's daughter, bring him to Jerusalem, he's going to think twice before attacking you. He's going to want you to succeed. After all, his daughter is there. He's going to want to make good relationships with you, good deals with you economically. He's going to want to be in a good place with you. Yeah, you could explain this away as kind of a professional, business, political transaction, and maybe it's just a small thing. Maybe it's just a little crack. And maybe everybody's doing this. And hey, maybe it's nothing. Maybe it's nothing. But it's there. And you notice the really shocking thing, if you're paying attention as we read through, you know when this was happening? While he was building the temple. While he was doing the good thing for the God that he served. While he was building the big thing. Listen, a lot of cracks go unnoticed when somebody can build big things. A lot of cracks go unnoticed when success is happening over here and nobody's looking over here. I'm not trying to make you suspicious of everybody you meet. I'm just saying. There's something about the gold and the building and the look at what we're doing that if we're not careful, hides what's underneath. And we want to ask, like, how can he do that? How can you have your heart all in on this temple for God, praying to God, hearing from God, and have this going on also? And I will tell you, I do not know the answer to that. Every time we hear of a high-profile failure, that's the question my wife asks me. How do you do that? I don't know. I just know that it gets done. Over and over again, back to Solomon and before and after and right up to our day, there are people building big things supposedly for God, and there's these little cracks that people look at and they go, well, maybe it's nothing. Maybe it's just me. Maybe it's just the way I'm looking at it. Maybe it's nothing. Second half of 1 Kings chapter 10, it gives example after example of Solomon's greatness and splendor and riches and influence. And then chapter 11 says, King Solomon, however, in spite of everything else we just said about him, all of it being true, in spite of his successes, King Solomon, however, while those good things were going on, King Solomon, however, loved many foreign women besides Pharaoh's daughter. And if you ever want a good list of Israel's enemies, here it comes. King Solomon loved many foreign women besides Pharaoh's daughter, Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites. They were from nations about which the Lord had told the Israelites, you must not intermarry with them because they will surely turn your hearts after their gods. God was very clear. Don't marry one, much less many. Don't marry from one enemy, much less multiple enemies. But the next line, verse 2 says, nevertheless, Solomon held fast to them in love. God said this, Solomon did this. Nevertheless, Solomon held fast to them in love. And if you just kind of pick that sentence up out of the story, you don't know the rest of the story, it's kind of a nice sentence, isn't it? Nevertheless, Solomon held fast to them in love. It's romantic. It's cinematic. Like this is a movie. Nevertheless, Solomon, so devoted, he held fast to them in love. There is a lot that sounds good and sweet and romantic that will carry our hearts far from God. If we just lift out, but I love her. If we just excerpt, but I love him. It sounds great. There's a lot about our feelings that will betray us. There's a lot about our feeling. Not everything about our feelings. Feelings are good, created by God, given by God. They can just be twisted. We can misread feelings. I'll say this and we'll move on. Our culture of falling in love will betray us if we aren't obeying God in our desires for love, in the way we go about loving, in whom we choose to love. There's a lot about that falling in love culture that will betray our hearts if we aren't careful. Verse 3. He had 700 wives. I don't know who counted. He had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines. Parents of sixth graders, explain that to them when you get home. And 300 concubines, and his wives led him astray. Not because they were his wives, not because they were women, because they worshiped false gods. They led him astray exactly the way God said they would. As Solomon grew old, his wives turned his hearts after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God as the heart of David, his father, had been. He followed Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. Skip a verse. On a hill east of Jerusalem, Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable god of Moab, and for Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. He did the same for all his foreign wives who burned incense and offered sacrifices to their gods. And little by little, crack by crack, relationship by relationship, the nation that God formed is littered with false gods and idols to false gods. One at a time. Just one at a time. One at a time. Another spot. Another place. Another false god. One at a time. One at a time. Here's what I want you to remember. Nothing is just nothing. Nothing turns into something before we realize it's not nothing. If you're not careful, I'm going to say it again. Nothing turns into something before we realize it's not nothing. We spend a lot of time saying, nothing, that's nothing. What are you talking about? Why are you so legalistic? Why are you in my business? I got this. This is under control. This is not what it looks like. Nothing? That nothing that we keep explaining away, nothing, sometimes it turns into something before we even realize it was never nothing. It was never nothing. My heart was getting divided. It was never nothing. Solomon's problem didn't happen at wife number 700. It wasn't like, okay, now we got a problem. No, he had a problem at wife number 1 and 2 and 3. All the way through. It didn't just suddenly become a problem. It was a problem at the beginning because something was going on in his heart. 1 Kings 11 is disastrous. Disastrous. Read it. God confronts Solomon at this point and says, this nation is going to fall to its enemies because of you and your decisions that will lead to more people making bad decisions because you kept explaining this away in your heart, and everything he built would be destroyed. I said I don't like to repeat. I'm actually repeating something now because I know I've said this before and I say it often. Nobody sets out at the beginning to destroy their life. Nobody. It's nobody's 5-year plan. It's not on anybody's vision board. Nobody writes it down in the journal. Just want to wreck everything. Nobody does that. Like, I want to have a really good marriage, like 10 years, just blow that sucker up in year 11. Like, I just want to destroy that thing. Nobody does that. I want to build a business with integrity. I want to do it the right way. 5 years before retirement, just want to embezzle like crazy. Just want to go to jail. I'm just hoping it works out that way. Nobody does it. Nobody sets out to end up there. It's just one nothing and another nothing and a little crack and another crack. And here we are. Here we are. The wisest man to ever live, he's described as, is foolish enough to get there. Don't think you aren't. Don't think I'm not. Here's one of our challenges. One of our challenges is we mistake God's patience with us. We mistake God's patience with us for getting away with it. We mistake God's patience with us for us getting away with it. Solomon seemed to have a free pass. He didn't really have a free pass throughout his life. We're short on time. I'm not going to track this down in the story. But throughout his life, people and God specifically kept showing up saying, look, if you will obey me, and I got such plans for you and your people and the future. If you will obey me, knowing that he wasn't obeying God at the time. You know, and I want to be clear. None of us want a God that every time we step out of line hits us with a lightning bolt. And that's not the God that we have. Thank goodness. None of us wants a God that every time we make a mistake, he comes in with all the punishment. That's not the God that we have. But sometimes we mistake that patience and that grace and that mercy for, well, I don't need to change anything. No, God is drawing, God is wooing you. God is saying, look, if you'll obey me, we don't have to get to this thing sinking. We don't have to get there. We don't have to get there. You can turn, you can change, you can write a different story for you. Solomon just kept going and kept going and kept going. And this incredible thing that God had built through him collapses. What's your story going to be? What's your story going to be? Like we know you, like we know the you that you let us see. We know the you that you present to all of us. One day the mini-series is coming out on all of us. It just will. You may be long gone by then. I may be long gone by then. But the mini-series comes out eventually on all of us. And the layers come out, and nobody expects anybody to be perfect because we're not. And God is gracious and forgiving when we turn to him. But, I mean, ultimately, what do you want that story to be? What story are you writing right now? Where in your heart are little things getting tucked away and you're saying, it's nothing. It's not. Stop asking me. That's not what it is. I just know that nothing becomes something. And then one day we wake up and realize it was never nothing. God, we pray you would open our hearts and examine our hearts and help us to be honest with ourselves. Just help us to get honest with ourselves and with you. To know that you love us and your grace and mercy are calling to us. And if we have stepped away, if we have started down another path, your voice is saying, look, if you'll come back, if you'll obey me, if you'll walk with me, I'm here, I'm your Father, I love you. I can keep you from getting to those consequences if you'll turn to me. God, none of us want to be legalistic. None of us want to be guilt-ridden. That's not what this is about. But we also want to be honest that we have the capability, in the same way that Solomon had the capability of ruining everything, of bringing everything down. If we don't walk committed to you, faithful to you, in love with you, passionate for you and what you're doing in our lives. Awaken our hearts to you. God, I pray it in Jesus' name. Amen.